Alright, Chapter 13, Social Psychology. I just want to give you guys a brief heads up for this one. This is my favorite field of psychology, so this will probably either be a long lecture or a two-parter. We'll see. We'll see how it happens. I'm also going to be bringing in elements of true crime throughout the lecture, so just kind of a content warning on that. So, what is social psychology? So social psychology is the study of how people influence others' behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes. It helps us understand not only why we sometimes act helpfully and even heroically in the presence of others, but also why we occasionally show our worst sides, caving to group pressure or standing by idly while others suffer. Remember the bystander effect? It also sheds light on why we're prone to accept blindly irrational things, even pseudoscientific belief. So research shows that we tend to believe that others are vulnerable to social influence, but we don't believe that we are. So we may resist some social psychological findings because they seem to apply to everyone else but us. So remember how we often think others are prone to errors in logic? That applies here as well. People are very prone to believe that they are the exception to the rule, even when they're not. Of all scientific principles we've talked about, replicability is one of the most important for this chapter. I don't remember if I've talked about the replicability crisis that psychology is going through. Well, crisis? I digress. Basically, some studies are much harder to replicate than others, and social psychology study findings are often difficult to replicate more often than not. One of the reasons for this is, since we're social creatures, people are susceptible to subtle interpersonal cues. Because of this, minor or trivial details of the experimental setup, like instructions given to participants, perceived attitudes, and even the appearance of the research assistants, the friendliness of other participants, etc., may influence the results of social psychology. So, most evidence suggests that as early hominids in Africa, yes, we all came from Africa, anthropology says so, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we evolved in relatively small and tight social bands. So even as modern-day humans, most of us gravitate to small groups. 150 is the approximate size of most human social groups, from the hunter-gatherer days of yore to today's scientists working in a specialized research area. Dunbar argued that the size of our cortex relative to the rest of our brain places limits on how many people with whom we closely associate. So why we form groups? When we're deprived of contact for a considerable length of time, we usually become lonely. According to psychologists Baumeister and Leary, who developed the need to belong theory, humans have a biologically based need for interpersonal connections. Schachter discovered the power of this social need in a small pilot study. Additionally, research on inmates in solitary confinement suggests that they experience more psychological symptoms, especially mood and anxiety problems, than do other inmates. They even appear to be more prone to suicidal behaviors. Still, because the inmates placed in solitary confinement may be more emotionally maladjusted to begin with, this finding is challenging to interpret with certainty. More systematic research shows that the threat of social isolation can lead us to behave in self-destructive ways and even impair our mental functioning. Research has found that participants given negative feedback, like "you're the type who will end up alone later in life," were more likely than those not given negative feedback to engage in unhealthy behaviors, like eating a fattening snack and procrastinating on an assignment. The same negative feedback is so upsetting that it may even impair people's performance on IQ tests. Brain imaging research goes a step further, shedding light on the commonplace observation that being cut off from the social contact hurts, literally and figuratively. This has been measured extensively with the program called Cyberball, which is where the participant is paired with two other participants that aren't actually participants, or they're not even real. It's just a simulated program where the only actor is the participant. They pass the ball between the three of them, and eventually the two fake participants or the two manufactured participants, stop passing the ball to the actual participant. Most participants don't like the experience and report feelings of rejection, social pain, sadness, and anger. Research using this paradigm even shows that Tylenol, as compared to a placebo, dampens the activity of the cingulate cortex, which is a brain region that becomes active when we face social rejection, indicating that we experience pain in response to social rejection in a similar way to how we experience physical pain. Other research further suggests that long-term loneliness can exert negative, at times even devastating effects on our psychological adjustment. Increases in loneliness are tied to heightened rates of depression. While these data are correlational, increases in depression don't predict increases in loneliness, suggesting a one-directional relationship. And this is why it's somewhat important to maintain social ties, even during COVID. So Zoom meetings can be fun. I've done some of these with some of my long-distance friends. Online gaming can be fun as well. The main thing is just not let the loneliness get the best of you. Hell, I've even had movie nights with just me and the cat. Granted, most of that time was spent keeping her out of my snacks, but still, same sentiment. As far as how we came to be this way. So, an evolutionary perspective on social behavior leads us to one crucial conclusion. Conformity, obedience, and many other forms of social influence become maladaptive only when they're followed blindly or unquestioningly. From this standpoint, irrational group behavior, like the disastrous obedience of thousands of Germans under the Nazi regime, are byproducts of basically adaptive processes that have gone horribly, horribly wrong. There's nothing wrong with looking to a persuasive leader for guidance, just as long as we don't stop asking tough questions. Once we accept social influence without evaluating it critically, we place ourselves at the mercy of powerful others. This is why it's important to do independent research and not blindly believe what you're told. Additionally, make sure your sources are credible and reliable. Remember, Uncle Dave or Aunt Karen aren't credible sources, neither are memes on social media, but the National Institute of Health is a credible source. Additionally, it's important to look at both sides of the problem. What are the pros and cons of each, merits and flaws, etc. So one reason others affect us is that they often serve a mirror of sorts, providing us with helpful information about ourselves. According to Festinger's social comparison theory, we seek to evaluate our abilities and beliefs by comparing them with those of others. Doing this helps us understand ourselves and our social worlds better. If you want to find out if you're a good psychology student, it's only natural to compare your exam performance with that of your classmates. This gives you a better sense of how you stack up relative to them and can spur you on to make any needed improvements in your study habits. Social comparison happens in two ways. First is upward comparison, which is when we compare ourselves with those who seem superior in some way. For example, poor people comparing themselves to more wealthy individuals, i.e., average Joe comparing himself to a celebrity. The other kind is downward comparison, in which we compare ourselves with others who seem inferior to us in some way. For example, celebrities comparing themselves to everyday people, or, more common example, older siblings comparing themselves to their younger siblings. Of course, this isn't to say younger siblings are inherently inferior. They're not. But it is easy to think yourself superior to an 8-year-old, so both upward and downward comparison can boost our self-concepts. When we engage in upward comparison, especially with those not too different from us, we may feel better because we can conclude that if they can do something, we can too. When we engage in downward comparison, we often end up feeling superior to our peers who are less competent than us in some domain of life. Downward comparison is probably part of why televised reality TV series, especially those about people being unsuccessful in relationships or friendships, are so popular. Additionally, even when social comparison makes us feel inferior, we may buffer our self-concepts by persuading ourselves that it's only because the focus of our comparison is exceptionally talented. So, for example, if you compare yourself to someone on American Idol, and you don't think you have the same skill they do, you can probably persuade yourself to believe, well, of course, they're awesome. They're on American Idol. They had to go through a vetting process. So we often look to others in ambiguous situations, and we don't know what to do. So when we experience severe turbulence on an airplane, we often look to the faces of other passengers or flight attendants to determine if we should panic or not. So mass hysteria is the outbreak of an irrational belief that's spread by social contagion, which is basically, social contagion is when people influence each other in a negative way. It's a little complicated. But remember the toilet paper shortage earlier this year? And then San Antonio had the self-induced gas shortage following Hurricane Harvey. Yeah, that actually happened. People in San Antonio thought we'd have a gas shortage, so a whole bunch of people went out to stock up, which created an actual gas shortage. Both of these are examples of mass hysteria. Because we're most likely to engage in social comparison when a situation is ambiguous, many of us are prone to mass hysteria under certain circumstances. Many wild rumors spread the same way and are often fueled by anxiety. Such rumors can occasionally lead to problematic, even disastrous consequences. In some cases, episodes of mass hysteria lead to collective delusions, which many people simultaneously become convinced of bizarre things that are false. For example, look at how many UFO sightings have been reported, or how many alien abductions have been reported. So, on a related note, urban legends. So, I have to admit, I love urban legends. I love urban legends and cryptids and anything spooky. Huge fan. There's actually a great movie called Cropsey that I believe is on Netflix about the urban legend of Cropsey. So urban legends are defined as false stories repeated so many times that people believe them to be true. And because I love urban legends, I'm going to briefly cover a couple. So first is the sewer gators. Sure, we've probably all heard the urban legend that there are alligators living in the sewers. This dates back to the late 20s and early 30s. And this is based upon reports of alligator sightings in really unorthodox locations, especially New York City. The New York Times reports the city rescues several alligators per year, some directly from homes where they're kept as illegal pets, which can be ordered online in other states and sent through the mail. Don't do that. They're not good pets. And some from outside, where they can attract considerable attention. It's really freaky to see a gator just taking a stroll across a fairway. Though escapees and former pets may survive for a short time in the New York sewers, long-term survival just isn't possible due to low temperatures in the bacteria. And sewer maintenance have confirmed there's no underground population of gators in the sewers in New York City. But for any of my fellow 90s kids, you can kind of see here that that may have fueled certain aspects of cartoons of our youth. May have also fueled the idea of Killer Croc in the comic books. The next one is Cropsey. So for the kids in Staten Island, Cropsey was the escaped mental patient who lived in the old abandoned Willowbrook Mental Institution, who would come out late at night and snatch children off the streets. Sometimes Cropsey had a hook for a hand, other times he wielded a bloody axe, but didn't matter, he was always out there lurking in the shadows waiting to grab the kids. And then in Cajun legends, the Rougarou, I think I'm saying that correctly, is said to prowl the swamps around Acadiana and greater New Orleans, and the sugarcane fields and the woodlands of the regions. So it's most often described as a creature with a human body and the head of a wolf or dog, similar to the werewolf legend. Another few prominent examples, La Llorona, which super interesting. Unfortunately, I'm not too knowledgeable about it, so I didn't want to spread information. But if you're interested, check it out. Within the age of the internet, it's easy for these stories to be brought to prominence. These make for good stories because they play on our emotions and our fears. Research shows that many urban legends contain an element that plays on disgust, because that arouses our weird sense of curiosity. And this provokes our interest and concern, and because of this, they spread like wildfire. Like the whole gators in the sewers thing. Like, I've heard that since I was little. It's been around for a while. When we try to figure out why someone did something, we're forming attributions, which are assigned causes of behavior. So some attributions are internal, so inside the person, like personality or intelligence. Other attributions are external, so outside the person, like societal pressures, poverty, etc. An example of an internal attribution would be, I adopted a cat because I like cats. An example of an external attribution would be, I adopted a cat because I had extra money and could afford one. More extreme example of an internal attribution would be, Ted Bundy did what he did because he was a sociopath. And more extreme example of an external attribution would be, Ted Bundy did what he did because his mother abused him as a child. Unfortunately, we tend to attribute too much of people's behavior to who they are as a person. And this is called fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency to overestimate the impact of dispositional influences on other people's behavior. So essentially, that person did a bad thing because they're a bad person. This is seen a whole lot when discussing crime, the justice system, and the prison system. I won't get too much into that because it is beyond the scope of this class, but if you'd like to learn about our prison system, highly recommend the documentary 13th, which is available on Netflix. Because of the fundamental attribution error, we also tend to underestimate the impact of situational influences on others' behavior, meaning that we attribute too little of their behavior to what's going on around them. No one knows for sure why we do this, but one likely culprit is the fact that we're barely aware of all the situational factors influencing someone else's life at a given time. As I mentioned in Chapter 12 lecture, we never really know what's going on in someone else's life. Maybe walking in someone else's shoes helps us grasp what they have to contend with. And this explanation dovetails with a curious finding that happens in some studies, but not all. So we tend to commit the fundamental attribution error only when explaining others' behaviors. When explaining the cause of our own behavior, we're often more likely to invoke situational factors, probably because we're well aware of what situational factors are affecting us. For example, I did a bad thing because of X, Y, and Z going on in my life. Another example is I chose to attend UTSA because my family vacationed here most summers when growing up, and I fell in love with the city. But my friend from high school attended UTSA because they were really motivated and worked hard and got in. As for evidence for this phenomenon, one famous study is from Jones and Harris, where they asked undergraduates to read a pre-written speech either in favor of or against Castro. They then asked other participants to guess the speaker's true opinion on Castro. Falling victim to the fundamental attribution error, most believe the speech the participants read reflected their true feelings toward Castro, even though they knew the speech assignment was random. They forgot to account for the situational factors of the experiment. As with everything in social psychology, there are cultural influences. So like a lot of other psychological phenomena, fundamental attribution error does have cultural differences. So for example, Japanese and Chinese people tend to do this less. This might be because they're more likely than those in Western cultures to view behaviors in context. As a result, they may be more prone to seeing others' behavior as a complex mix of both dispositional and situational factors. For example, after reading newspaper descriptions of mass murderers, Chinese people are less likely to invoke dispositional explanations for their behavior and more likely to invoke situational explanations. In contrast, those from the US show the opposite pattern. This cultural difference even extends to inanimate objects. Within Western cultures, there are intriguing differences in the tendency to commit the fundamental attribution error. For example, Protestants are more prone to make dispositional attributions than are Catholics, probably because they're especially likely to believe in a soul, which is a spiritual entity that lives within us even after death. So yeah. So social influence, this is where a lot of the unethical studies we discussed towards the beginning of this semester come into play. Like I said before, even though they were unethical, they did contribute a lot to the field. So yeah, they were questionable, but the state of psychology probably wouldn't be where it is today if they hadn't happened. So, pros and cons. So conformity is the tendency of people to alter their behavior as a result of group pressure. We all conform to group pressure at some point and to some degree, but sometimes this gets taken just a little too far. So some of the pioneering studies done on conformity were done by Solomon Asch and associates. So Asch conducted a classic study in the 50s. His design was simple but very elegant. He employed the use of confederates, which are participants, in the study that aren't actually participants. These individuals are tools used by the researcher to influence the behavior of actual participants. So essentially, Asch had participants and confederates examine the length of 3 lines, which I've shown you here, and decide which was the same length as the comparison line, or which comparison line was the same length as the standard line. The first trial, all confederates gave the correct answer. The second trial, all confederates gave the wrong answer. And 75% of participants would conform and also give the wrong answer. This was done a total of 12 times. And participants conformed with the group about 37% of the time. While this is a trivial situation, participants still reported confusion and experiencing a conflict between their perceptions and the perceptions of others. So Asch and other researchers went on to pinpoint social factors that influence how likely are people to conform. So they concluded that conformity was influenced by the following independent variables. First is uniformity of agreement. If all confederates gave the wrong answer, the participant was more likely to conform, but if one confederate gave the right answer, the level of conformity dropped down by 75%. Another factor was the difference in the wrong answer. So, knowing that someone else in the group differed from the majority, even if that person held a different view from that of the participant, so for example, let's say the correct line was line 3, participant said 3, all of the confederates except for one said 2, and then one confederate said 1, this would be that kind of situation. So, even if that person had a different view from the participant, this made the participant less likely to conform. And lastly was size. So the size in the majority made a difference, but only up to about 5 or 6 confederates. People were no more likely to conform in a group of 10 than in a group of 5. Asch even tried to rule out alternative hypotheses by repeating his original study, but asked participants to write rather than call out their answers. In this setup, participants were right 99% of the time, suggesting that conformity only affects people's expressed behavior, not their perceptions of reality. And his findings have 2 important implications. So first is most people will blindly conform to group pressure from time to time, but many can and do resist the power of the group. In fact, in Asch's study, participants went against the norm roughly 2/3 of the time, so about 66% of the time. While group influence is powerful, it's not irresistible. So while Asch concluded that conformity only affects observable behavior, brain imaging studies raise the possibility that social pressure may, at times, influence perception as well. So Burns found high levels of conformity in participants that went along with the wrong answer about 41% of the time. Their conforming behavior was associated with activation in the amygdala, which tends to trigger anxiety in response to danger cues, and is on the emotion center of the brain. This suggests that conformity may come with the price of negative emotions, namely anxiety. Burns and colleagues also found that conformity was associated with activity in the parietal and occipital lobes, the areas of the brain associated with visual perception. So this suggests that social pressure might sometimes affect how we perceive reality, although activity in these brain areas may have instead reflected participants' tendency to doubt and then recheck their initial perceptions. And of course, there are group differences here as well. So people's responses to social pressure are also associated with individual and cultural differences, underscoring the point that not all of us conform all the time. Those with low self-esteem are especially prone to conform. The book believes that this is because they likely fear disapproval, but it could also be because they seek approval and acceptance. So most Asians are more likely to conform to group norms than are Americans. This is likely due to most Asian cultures being more collectivistic than American culture. Those in collectivistic cultures tend to want to blend in more, whereas those in more individualistic cultures like the US tend to want to stand out from the crowd. While culture plays a role, it doesn't seem that gender does. So early studies suggested that women are more likely to conform, but because these experimenters were all men, there was a possibility that they accidentally provoked submissive behavior in the women. Later studies conducted by women found the sex difference in conformity nearly vanished. So yeah. So one process that makes people vulnerable to conformity is de-individuation, which is the tendency of people to engage in uncharacteristic behavior when they are stripped of their usual identities. This is typically the first step cults take in indoctrinating new members, but we'll go over cults a little bit more in depth later in the chapter. So several factors contribute to de-individuation, but the most prominent are a feeling of anonymity and a lack of personal responsibility. When we're de-individuated, we become more vulnerable to social influences, including the impact of social roles. So the advent of online interactions may contribute to de-individuation, in turn leading to a heightened risk of flaming, which is sending insulting messages to other people. And once people start sending nasty anonymous comments on YouTube videos, others quickly pile on, a phenomenon that scholars call online disinhibition effect. Other examples are when people wear masks or sunglasses. They tend to behave differently than when they don't. Apparently, the mere illusion of anonymity can lead to de-individuation. So this was demonstrated by Zimbardo. Of course, he conducted the Stanford prison experiment. Zimbardo knew about the ghastly conditions of many prisons and wondered whether they stemmed from people's personalities or from the roles they're required to adopt. The roles of prisoner and guard, which are inherently antagonistic, may carry such powerful expectations that they generate self-fulfilling prophecies. As a reminder, Zimbardo randomly assigned people to either be prisoners or guards in a fake prison. They were in the prison for 6 days until the study was abruptly ended because of the psychological distress it was causing participants, especially those assigned to be prisoners. Those assigned to be guards fully embraced and abused their power over the prisoners. This study, while very influential, has been rightfully criticized. In particular, the study wasn't well controlled. In many respects, it was more of a demonstration than an experiment. His guards and prisoners may have experienced demand characteristics to behave in accord with their assigned roles. Among other things, they may have assumed that the investigators wanted them to play the parts of guards and prisoners and obliged. This type of demand characteristic is called a good participant effect, and that participants may go beyond what the experimenter wanted them to do in order to be a good participant. These demand characteristics may have accidentally been heightened by the researchers. There's evidence that during the study, Zimbardo referred to himself and the guards as "we," implying that he was allied with the guards, which may have encouraged the guards to create a hostile environment for the prisoners. Additionally, one study tried to replicate Zimbardo's findings and failed. On a related note, Zimbardo's findings may have been due in part to bias in participant selection. Those who volunteered were high in aggressiveness, manipulativeness, narcissism, and dominance, and low scores on altruism and empathy, all traits that one could expect to be related to sadistic behavior. So there's a likelihood that these participants weren't as average as Zimbardo tried to paint them. De-individuation also helps explain why crowd behavior is so unpredictable. The actions of people in crowds depends largely on whether others are acting pro-socially or anti-socially. A myth that's endured for centuries is that crowds are always more aggressive than individuals. Le Bon argued that crowds are a recipe for irrational and even destructive behavior. According to Le Bon, people in crowds are more anonymous and therefore more likely to act on their impulses than are individuals. In some cases, Le Bon was right. One example of this is the Black Friday madness that happens in places like Walmart, where people either almost come to blows or do actually get into physical altercations over a flat screen. In 2008, an employee at Walmart was trampled to death when they opened the doors on Black Friday. However, in some cases, the crowd is less aggressive than the individual. Depending on prevailing social norms, de-individuation can make us either more or less aggressive. Moreover, people in crowds typically limit their social interactions to minimize conflict. Even the online disinhibition effect is more complex than originally believed, because in some cases it contributes to pro-social comments on blogs. For example, online self-disclosure regarding one person's emotionally painful experiences, such as struggles with depression or eating disorders, is often followed by online expressions of sympathy and self-disclosure by others. So, on a related note, groupthink is the emphasis on group unanimity at the expense of critical thinking. This is closely related to conformity. Groups sometimes become so intent on ensuring that everyone agrees with everyone else that they lose their capacity to evaluate issues objectively. To be sure, groups, including juries and presidential cabinets, often make good decisions, especially when group members are free to contribute opinions that aren't influenced by peer pressure. However, sometimes groups make poor, even terrible decisions, especially when members' judgment aren't independent of one another. When groups combine information from members, they typically rely on common knowledge, which is information all the members share, rather than unique knowledge, resulting in no net gain in new information. Just like popular psychology, widely held knowledge is sometimes very inaccurate. So one example of buffoonery due to groupthink was the botched invasion of the Bay of Pigs under the Kennedy presidency. Another is the Challenger explosion, which had a documentary on Netflix it has a documentary on Netflix called Challenger, The Final Flight. Basically, what happened here is someone knew the Challenger wasn't going to make it, but NASA sent it anyways. Ironically, some critics have accused social psychology of groupthink. These critics believe that social psychology is a left-leaning field and tends to be politically liberal, and because of this, it ignores politically conservative ideas and approaches to things like affirmative action, capital punishment, and abortion. In any case, it's clear the viewpoint diversity, which is valuing a range of different perspectives, is a crucial antidote to groupthink, both within and outside academia, and viewpoint diversity can't really be achieved without independent research and evaluation. So Janice put forth a few symptoms of groupthink, which I have outlined here in the table. So first is an illusion of the group's invulnerability. An example, we possibly can't fail. An illusion of the group's unanimity, meaning everyone's unanimous, so they all agree. An unquestioned belief in the group's moral correctness, we know we're on the right side. Stereotyping of the outgroup, a caricaturing of the enemy. They're all morons. Conformity pressure, which is pressure on group members to go along with everyone else, essentially don't rock the boat. Self-censorship, so this is the tendency of group members to keep their mouths shut even when they have doubts. So if they suspect the leader is stupid, but they don't really say anything. And then last we have mind guards, which are self-appointed individuals whose job it is to stifle disagreement. Oh, you think you know better than the rest of us. So, I normally try to keep politics out of my lectures, but I want to point out how you can see elements of this on both sides of the political aisle, sometimes more on one side than the other. On a related note, for any that have Hulu, there's a very interesting documentary on Hulu called Totally Under Control about the management of COVID. I challenge all that have Hulu, or can find the documentary elsewhere, to watch this documentary and see how many of these symptoms come into play. Groupthink doesn't always lead to bad decisions, just overconfident ones. Seeking group consensus isn't always a bad thing, but doing so before all the relevant evidence is available is. Groupthink, like all social psychological phenomena, isn't inevitable. Janice noted that the best way to avoid groupthink is to encourage dissent within an organization. If people are afraid to share their different viewpoint, it makes the organization more susceptible to groupthink. This is where the term devil's advocate comes from. However, the word's been really overused in the wrong context and has kind of lost its original meaning. So the original meaning behind devil's advocate was someone appointed to voice doubts about the group's decision. Nowadays, it's usually used to invalidate someone else's point on social media. With that being said, when a devil's advocate is used in the way it was originally intended, it can reduce groupthink and lead to better decisions. Another effective preventative measure is to split the group into smaller teams and asking them to debate alternative courses of action. In addition, Janice suggested having independent experts on hand to evaluate whether the group's decisions make sense. So holding a follow-up meeting to evaluate if the decision reached in the first meeting still seems reasonable can serve as a helpful check against errors in reasoning. Research also suggests that increasing racial and cultural diversity within groups can result in better decisions because it can lead to the consideration of different perspectives because, shocker, those with different life experiences can contribute different perspectives that people may not think about if they haven't had those life experiences. For example, if there are at least 2 black people on a jury, this tends to lead to more careful consideration of the facts and more fair verdicts. Related to groupthink is group polarization, which is the tendency of group discussion to strengthen the dominant positions held by individual group members. In one study, a group of students who were slightly unprejudiced became less prejudiced after discussing racial issues, whereas a group that was slightly prejudiced became more prejudiced after discussing racial issues. Group polarization can be helpful if it leads to efficient decisions. In other cases, it can be destructive, as when juries rush to unanimous decisions before they've considered all the evidence. There's increasing evidence that the American government is becoming increasingly polarized, with left-leaning individuals becoming more liberal or more leftist, and right-leaning individuals becoming more conservative. In fact, in the U.S., prejudice towards people in opposing parties now equals or exceeds prejudice against people of different races. These negative attitudes make it challenging for reasonable people to find common ground on social and political issues. Some of this polarization may be due to the increasing accessibility of internet blogs, continually updated websites, social media of all sorts, radio talk shows, and TV, which is used by both sides to push their views and somewhat fuel their confirmation bias. Another contributing factor could be the way certain politicians discuss certain topics. For example, twisting science and data-supported evidence into political opinions can really add gas to the fire, especially among those who don't fully understand science or data-supported evidence. Few people on either extreme expose themselves to opposing viewpoints. So, as I mentioned before, love true crime, so I'm going to go a little in-depth with some of my examples in this section. So we will be talking about Heaven's Gate, Jim Jones in Jonestown, and David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. So in extreme forms, groupthink can lead to cults, which are groups of individuals who exhibit intense and unquestioning devotion to a single individual or cause. The book says most cults aren't dangerous, but they neglect to mention that dangerous and harmful are not the same. So most cults can be harmful to their members, even if they aren't dangerous to the general public. One example is of a harmful cult was Heaven's Gate. This was founded in 1975 by Marshall Applewhite, a former psychiatric patient. Cult members believed that Applewhite was a reincarnated version of Jesus Christ. Applewhite, they believed, would take them to a starship in their afterlives. So, in 1997, a major comet approached Earth, and there were several false reports that circulated in the media that a spaceship was tailing it. Heaven's Gate members believed that this was their calling, and almost all of them, 39 members, committed suicide by drinking a poisoned cocktail. Another example of a harmful but not necessarily dangerous cult was the People's Temple, formed by Jim Jones in 1955. This was a religious cult, as many are. But one thing that set them apart was the interweaving of Christian beliefs and socialism. After several members defected, Jones moved the People's Temple and its members to Guyana. Eventually, things got bad for the cult members. Jones worked his members to the bone with 12-hour days, 6 days a week. He also used behavior modification and brainwashing, which we'll get to in a little bit. Jones was afraid of more dissent and more people leaking details of his practices. Eventually, things came to a boiling point, and his followers were forced, by the threat of being shot by armed guards, to poison their children and then themselves with poisoned flavor aid. This is where the phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, comes from. Both of these are brief examples, and more detailed accounts can be found online. So, because cults are secretive and difficult to study, we know relatively little about them in terms of research. The best we have are case studies and reports from those who have defected or survived. Both. There is a documentary on Hulu called Cults and Extreme Beliefs that covers a few of them, as well as Jonestown Truth and Lies that gives an in-depth look at the events that led to and occurred at Jonestown. There's also a documentary about the Nexium cult called The Vow on Hulu. This one is touched on in Cults and Extreme Beliefs, but The Vow takes a much more in-depth look. For those with Netflix that don't have Hulu, there's one called Children of God about a sex cult with the same name. Additionally, there's one called Bikram about a multi-level modeling approach that took things to the extreme and involved many unsavory events between Bikram and his followers. Evidence suggests that cults promote groupthink in 4 major ways. First is having a persuasive leader who fosters loyalty, disconnecting group members from the outside world, discouraging questioning of the group's assumptions, establishing training practices that gradually indoctrinate members. So despite how the media and popular knowledge may portray them, most cult members are psychologically normal. But most cult leaders are, to be frank, little nutter butters, in that they suffer from either extreme psychological illness, so delusions of being a holy entity, or personality disorders, like narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. The belief that followers must be psychologically ill probably stems from the fundamental attribution error. People think they would never fall into a cult, but it can happen easier than you might think. We make the same mistake when evaluating personality traits of terrorists, who tend to be similar to most cult members. Most of these individuals have been indoctrinated into a warped ideology. Terrorist organizations are one example of a cult that is dangerous. Another was the Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh. So, I want to add a little caveat to this. So had the events of Waco played out differently, I would say they were neither harmful, well, no, they were definitely harmful, but I wouldn't say they were dangerous. However, since things played out the way they did, the Branch Davidians check both boxes. There's a documentary on Netflix called Waco, and another on Hulu called Truth and Lies Waco. Both of these go into great detail on the events that happened in Waco, with the Branch Davidians and their clash between federal agencies. So I'm only going to give an overview simply because I don't have time to cover all of it. It was a very kind of situation. Like, there was so many things that went wrong and botched handling of things by the federal government, and things could have gone a lot differently than the way they actually did. And both of those documentaries explain it a lot better than I can. So, while David Koresh did not found the Branch Davidians, he played a pivotal role. They believed he was the Messiah. Since they believed he was the Messiah, parents were willing to marry their adolescent and teenage daughters to him. As for the events that transpired at Waco, the Branch Davidians were raided by the ATF, who set fire to their compound, and the FBI. This resulted in a firefight between the Branch Davidians and the government agencies, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. Another common misconception is that all cult members are brainwashed, or transformed by group leaders into unthinking zombies. While some scientists argue that many cults use brainwashing techniques, the existence of brainwashing is scientifically controversial. There's not a lot of evidence that brainwashing permanently alters victims' beliefs. Additionally, brainwashing is probably far less effective than most people assume. There's reason to doubt if brainwashing is a unique means of changing people's behavior. Instead, the persuasive techniques of brainwashing probably aren't all that different from those used by effective political leaders and salespeople. So, how can we best resist indoctrination into cults? Well, step one is knowing the warning signs. So here I have listed 10 warning signs about a potentially unsafe group/leader. So first is absolute authoritarianism without meaningful accountability. No tolerance for questions or critical inquiry. No meaningful financial disclosure regarding budget, expenses, such as an independently audited financial statement. Unreasonable fear about the outside world, such as impending catastrophe, evil conspiracies, and persecutions. There's no legitimate reason to leave. Former followers are always wrong in leaving, negative, or even evil for leaving. I know that sounds extreme, but that happens. Former members often relate the same stories of abuse and neglect and reflect a similar pattern of grievances. There are records, books, news articles, or television programs that document the abuses of the group/leader. Followers feel they can never be good enough. The group or the leader is always right. The group/leader is the exclusive means of knowing truth or receiving validation, and no other process of discovery is really acceptable or credible. So here are 10 warning signs regarding people involved with or involved in potentially unsafe groups or leaders. So first we have extreme obsessiveness regarding the group/leader, resulting in the exclusion of almost every practical consideration. Individual identity, the group, the leader, and or God as a distinct and separate categories of existence become increasingly blurred. Instead, the followers merge these identities and they become increasingly fused as that person's involvement with the group/leader continues and deepens. Whenever the group or leader is criticized or questioned, it is characterized as persecution. Uncharacteristically stilted and seemingly programmed conversation and mannerisms, cloning of the group/leader in personal behavior, dependency upon the group/leader for problem-solving solutions and definitions without meaningful reflective thought, a seeming inability to think independently or analyze situations without the group/leader involvement, hyperactivity centered on the group/leader agenda, which seems to supersede any personal goals or individual interests, a dramatic loss of spontaneity and sense of humor, increasing isolation from family and old friends unless they demonstrate an interest in the group or leader. Anything the group or leader does can be justified no matter how harsh or harmful. Former followers are at best considered negative or worse, evil, and under bad influences. They cannot be trusted, and personal contact is avoided. So essentially, they are excommunicated. Another way to avoid falling susceptible to a cult is exposing people to information consistent with cults and then debunking it. So McGuire, with his work on the inoculation effect, demonstrated that the best way of immunizing people against an undesirable belief is to gently introduce them to reasons this belief seems correct, which gives them the chance to generate their own counter-arguments against those reasons. In this way, they'll become more resistant to the arguments for this belief and more open to arguments against it in the future. This approach works much like a vaccine, which inoculates people against a virus by presenting them with a small dose of it, thereby activating the body's defenses. So, obedience is different from conformity in one key way. In conformity, the pressure comes from peers, whereas with obedience, the pressure comes from an authority figure. Another difference is in conformity, the influence is usually implicit, whereas in obedience, the influence is usually, almost always, explicit or stated. Many groups, like cults, use both to acquire their influence. So obedience is a necessary, even essential, ingredient in our daily lives. Without it, society couldn't run smoothly. Like conformity, obedience can produce troubling consequences when people stop asking questions about why they're behaving as others want them to. This field of study around obedience started after the Nuremberg trials, in which Nazi war criminals claimed they were merely following orders. So Milgram was a graduate student who studied under Solomon Asch, and he sought to understand the principles underlying irrational group behavior. Since he was a child of two Jewish parents that grew up during World War II, Milgram wanted to understand how the Holocaust could have happened. The main narrative in the 40s and the 50s was that it occurred as the product of twisted minds that had perpetuated dastardly deeds. Milgram suspected that the truth was more subtle, and in some ways more frightening, as he came to believe that the psychological processes that give rise to destructive obedience are surprisingly commonplace. So, as a refresher, Milgram studied obedience in a very simple way. He had a Confederate who was allegedly receiving electrical shocks given by participants with increasing intensity. The participants were persuaded to keep giving the high voltage shocks to the Confederate. Each time the voltage would increase. While very unethical, this became one of the best known and most influential psychological studies ever done. So, like Asch, Milgram conducted a variety of follow-up studies to pinpoint the situational factors that affected obedience and to rule out alternative explanations for his findings. These studies provide an elegant demonstration of social psychological research at its best, as well as affording a powerful test of the replicability of Milgram's paradigm and its generalizability across situations. So, the first variation was the remote feedback condition, this was the initial study. So, no verbal feedback from the person receiving the shocks. The teacher hears only the teacher being the participant. Hears only the learner pounding the wall in protest after being shocked. The voice feedback condition. The teacher hears the learner's screams of pain and complaints. The proximity condition. Learners in the same room as the teacher, so that the teacher not only hears, but also observes the learner's agony. The touch proximity condition, so the teacher is required to hold the learner's hand on a shock plate. Whenever the learner's hand flies off the shock plate, the teacher must jam it back down to ensure electrical contact. So notice the percent of who gave the max amount of volts, which was 450. So in the initial study, it was 65%, voice feedback 62%, proximity 40%, the touch proximity 30%. Then there was the telephone condition, in which the experimenter gives instructions by phone from a separate room. The second experimenter condition, which is where the second experimenter is present and begins disagreeing with the first experimenter about whether to carry on with the session. The less prestigious setting for a study, so the study is conducted in a rundown office building in nearby Connecticut, removing all affiliation with Yale. And then lastly, ask teacher to direct a different participant to administer the shock. So the teacher is asked to give orders to a Confederate who then delivers the shocks. In this condition, teachers can reassure themselves. And again, notice the percent of individuals who did give the max amount of volts. 30 for the telephone, 0 for the second experimenter condition, 48 for the less prestigious setting, and 93%. So this one can seem shocking at first, but not necessarily, because if you take away their responsibility for the consequences, of course more people are going to do it. They're just telling, Joe Schmo, like, hey, zap this guy, instead of themselves actually having to do it. And then in the second experimenter condition, it's 0. No one gave the 450 volts because the second experimenter was providing dissent that went against the pressure from the authority figure. So as we can see, the level of participants' obedience varied depending on the number of independent variables, including amount of feedback, proximity from the learner, and the physical proximity and prestige of the experimenter. Although this table displays numerous variations, two key themes emerge. First, the greater the psychological distance between teacher and learner, aka between participant and Confederate, the less obedience. Second, the greater the psychological distance between the teacher and the learner, the more obedience. And of course, there are differences between groups, so when evaluating Milgram's findings, it's only natural to focus on the sizable portion of participants who followed orders, yet many of his participants didn't go along with the experimenter's commands despite the intense pressure to do so. So despite powerful situational pressures, some people disobey authority figures who give unethical orders. Milgram found that obedient and disobedient participants scored similarly on personality measures. Research has identified a few predictors of obedience in Milgram's paradigm. For example, more morally advanced participants are more likely to disobey the experimenter, and especially moral people may sometimes be more willing to violate the rules than less moral people, especially if they view the rules as unreasonable. Another study found that those with high levels of a personality trait called authoritarianism are more likely to obey the experimenter's instructions. People with high levels of authoritarianism view the world as a big hierarchy of power. For them, authority figures are to be respected, not questioned. A more recent study found that those with elevated levels of agreeableness and conscientiousness were more likely to obey the experimenter than were other participants, probably because they were reluctant to offend authority figures and felt obligated to adhere to societal norms. However, Milgram found no consistent sex differences, and this finding is held up across replications. Additionally, there aren't consistent cultural variations either. So Milgram's work teaches us that the power of the authority figure is greater than almost anyone had imagined, and that obedience doesn't typically result from sadism. Milgram's research also reminds us the power of fundamental attribution error. So most people underestimate situational factors on behavior. Psychologists continue to debate whether Milgram's study offers an adequate model of what happened during the Holocaust. Critics argue that destructive obedience on a grand scale probably requires not only an authority figure bearing an official stamp of approval, but also a core group of genuinely wicked people. Others have questioned if Milgram's participants and others who engage in obedience are truly mindless, blind followers. Perhaps the obedient participants believe the authority figures are doing the right thing and are actively choosing to help them. Researchers have also raised questions about Milgram's findings and conclusions. For example, a careful look revealed that the standardization of experiments, long assumed to be very rigorous, sometimes left something to be desired. Additionally, sometimes Confederates went off script. Controversies aside, though, there's no doubt that Milgram forever changed how we think about ourselves and others. Even though we're all familiar with the saying safety in numbers, this isn't always true. Recall the bystander effect and how individuals are less likely to help when there are others nearby. Some famous examples are kidnappings like of Adam Walsh, who was taken from a Sears department store, Elizabeth Smart, who was taken from her home, and J.C. Dugard, I'm not sure how to say that, who was taken while she was walking to school. So when I first learned of all of these, my first reaction was, why didn't anyone stop these people from taking these kids? Why did no one intervene? And this section goes more in depth into the lack of bystander intervention. So, some causes. So for many years, many psychologists assumed that non-responsiveness of bystanders was due simply to a lack of caring, and some even referred to the phenomenon as bystander apathy. Darley and Latane suspected that bystander effect was less a consequence of apathy than of psychological paralysis. According to them, bystanders in emergencies typically want to intervene, but often find themselves frozen, seemingly unable to help. Darley and Latane also suspected that popular psychology was wrong, that there's actually danger rather than safety in numbers. Going against conventional wisdom, they hypothesized that the presence of others makes people less likely to help in emergencies. So they maintained that there are two major factors that explain bystander non-intervention. The first is pluralistic ignorance, which is the error of assuming that no one in a group perceives things as we do. So to intervene in an emergency, we first need to recognize that the situation is an emergency. For example, if you see someone passed out in a public space and no one else is responding, you may convince yourself that there's not actually an emergency. You might assume you're the only one who thinks this is potentially an emergency. One mundane example of this is when a lecture concludes and the professor asks if there are any questions and no one asks questions. In this instance, you may assume you're the only one with questions. However, I highly recommend or highly encourage you to ask questions in this instance. Even in our current online format, if you have questions or are unsure about something, I can almost guarantee that someone else has the same question but is too scared to ask. Professors love to get questions about the content. It's our job to make sure you learn, but we don't know what you don't know. Help us to help you, because it's one thing for teachers and stuff like that to know the information, to have that information, and then try to relay it to people who don't know it or don't have that information. So we never truly know what you guys don't know or don't understand. So pluralistic ignorance is especially important when we're unsure if something is an emergency, but it doesn't fully explain the behavior of bystanders in all situations. Even once we recognize that the situation is an emergency, the presence of others still tends to inhibit helping. The second step in intervening in emergency is we need to feel a burden of responsibility for the consequences of not intervening. The catch here is the more people present at an emergency, the less each person feels responsible for the outcomes of this situation. So Darley and Latane called this the diffusion of responsibility. The presence of others makes each individual feel less responsible for the consequences. De-individuation can be applied here. If someone sees themselves as part of a collective, they're more easily to distribute the blame away from themselves. To get to the bottom of this phenomenon, Darley and Latane and their associates tested the effects on participants' willingness to report smoke that was filling a room, react to what sounded like a woman falling off a ladder and injuring herself, and respond to what sounded like another student experiencing an epileptic seizure. The studies have been replicated across multiple different study designs. One study found that people were more likely to help when alone than in groups, about 90% of the time. Even thinking about being part of a group decreases the likelihood of intervention. However, research suggests that when an emergency is physically dangerous for victims, bystanders may be somewhat more likely to intervene than when it's not especially dangerous. Also, the bystander effect can be eliminated when people believe there's a chance they might be watched. There's reason to believe that exposure to research on bystander effects may boost the chances of intervening in emergencies. This demonstrates the Enlightenment effect, which is learning about research can change real-world behavior for the better. This is also why I think everyone should take a psychology class at least once, but that's just my opinion. I'm a little biased on that. For anyone interested, there is a TV show with clips available on YouTube called What Would You Do? That's based entirely on the bystander effect. It's not about emergencies, more so social experiments, but it is interesting to watch. So, if you haven't already, you probably will experience this phenomenon before you get your bachelor's degree. Anyone that has ever done a group project with someone that doesn't carry their own weight has experienced social loafing. This is when individuals become less productive in groups. When social loafing occurs, the whole is less than the sum of its parts. Some researchers believe social loafing is a variation of bystander non-intervention, and that it appears to be due in part to the diffusion of responsibility. People working in groups typically feel less responsible for the outcome of a project than they do when working alone. As a result, they don't invest as much effort. Like many other social psychology phenomenon, social loafing can be influenced by cultural factors. People in individualistic cultures like the US are more prone to social loafing than people in collectivistic cultures like China or Japan, probably because people in the latter countries feel more responsible for the outcomes of the group's success or failures. One of the antidotes for social loafing is to ensure each person in the group is identifiable by guaranteeing that managers, bosses, or professors can evaluate each individual's performance. By doing so, it helps reduce the diffusion of responsibility. Going back to my example about group projects, there are a few ways to approach this. One thing you could do is, if you're one of the ones carrying the group, talk to the person that isn't contributing. You can tell them you think they should contribute more, which can and has led to conflict in my experience. So, not highly recommended. Another approach is to assign each individual a certain aspect of the group project. This should help diminish some of the diffusion of responsibility. That way, everyone feels directly responsible for the portion they're supposed to contribute. For example, if it's a presentation and there are 4 people presenting, you can assign each person, X amount of slides with X amount of information. But that being said, I would recommend preparing a backup just in case they don't come through. If that happens, just talk to your professor about it. We've either seen it or we've experienced it ourselves. So while the bystander effect can happen, many people still help in situations when others are present. There is good evidence that many people engage in altruism, which is helping others for unselfish reasons. I believe this can be influenced by an individual's upbringing. For me personally, my dad was a volunteer fireman in my hometown and has been for about 20 years. He spent 2 decades spending holidays and weekends away from his family to help the town. I feel like this influenced both myself and my little brother in our willingness to help others. But again, just me. For a while, researchers argued that people only helped others for selfish reasons, like relieving our own distress, experiencing the joy of others we've helped, or anticipating that people we've helped will be more likely to reciprocate by helping us later. From this perspective, we help others only to benefit ourselves. However, Batson and Associates showed that we sometimes engage in genuine altruism. Basically, we help others in discomfort because we feel empathetic toward them and we sympathize with their feelings. I am going to get on the soapbox for a little bit here. If you ever help the homeless, but only do so because you want to record it and put it on social media, you're not doing it for the right reasons. If you want to help homeless individuals because you truly want to help them, don't record that. It's very dehumanizing. On a similar note, don't help other people just so you can brag about it to others. That isn't altruism. That's helping someone else for selfish reasons. I mean, yes, still help people, but just don't be a jerk about it. Of course, there are situational influences. So people are more likely to help in some situations than others. They're more likely to help others when they can't easily escape the situation. So for example, people are more likely to help someone who collapses on a crowded subway than on a sidewalk. As mentioned in the bystander section, people are more likely to intervene in events that pose immediate physical harm to strangers. Characteristics of the victim also matter. For example, people were about 45% more likely to help those with a cane than an obviously drunk person. This is likely because people would view the individual with the cane as not responsible for their need for help, but view the drunk person as responsible for their own actions that made them drunk. And that's just a speculation of mine, but I think it plays a role. Another reason this may be is because most of us probably know someone who needs to or has used a cane, so we're more likely to be sympathetic towards a person with a cane. For example, if we see an elderly person having trouble or fall, we might show them some sympathy because they remind us of our parents, grandparents. However, this area can get a little dicey when it comes to individuals with disabilities. Sometimes people may intervene in a situation that did not require intervention simply because they saw a disabled person having difficulty with an everyday task. In emergency situations like heart attacks, you should intervene. But if it's not an emergency, it's best to ask the individual if they need help before intervening. The same can also be said for able-bodied individuals. If it's not an emergency, it's usually best to ask before intervening. For example, don't assume a pregnant woman needs help loading groceries in her car, but if you want to help, just ask first. So, on a sort of related note, if there's a cause you're very passionate about, I highly encourage you to volunteer with organizations that contribute to that cause. For example, if you love animals, volunteer or donate dog or cat food and toys to animal shelters. If you're worried about the cleanliness of the ocean, volunteer with organizations that help clean up garbage and litter from beaches. If you've experienced something very negative in your personal life, you can find an organization that helps others going through that. As far as individual differences in personality also influence the likelihood of helping, again reminding us that interpersonal behavior is a function of both person and situation. Participants who are less concerned about social approval are more likely to go against the grain and intervene in emergencies, even when others are present. Extroverted people are prone to help others more than introverts. Even when they're off duty, people with life-saving abilities, like nurses, doctors, EMTs, paramedics, etc., are more likely to offer assistance to others in emergencies than are other people. For example, we all know the movie and TV trope of, "Is there a doctor here?" That's where this comes from and where this applies as well. So, like our cousins, the chimpanzees, we occasionally engage in violence against others. Like them, we're a war-waging species. For example, the U.S. has been engaged in conflicts in the Middle East for at least a few decades now. Psychologists define aggression as behavior intended to harm others, either verbally or physically or both. Psychologists have pinpointed a bunch of situational influences on aggression. So first is interpersonal provocation. We're especially likely to lash out aggressively against those who have provoked us by insulting, threatening, or hitting us. Frustration, we're especially likely to behave aggressively when frustrated. Media influences, sometimes watching media violence can increase the odds of violence through observational learning. Additionally, some research suggests that violent video games can increase aggression, but some critics don't believe these studies have very much external validity, meaning they don't generalize to the real world very well. External cues associated with violence, like guns and knives, can serve as a discriminative stimuli for aggression, making us more likely to act violently in response to provocation. When our autonomic nervous system is hyped up or aroused, we may mistakenly attribute this arousal to anger, leading us to act aggressively. Certain substances, like alcohol and other drugs, can disinhibit our brain's prefrontal cortex, lowering our inhibitions toward behaving violently. And Lastly, as I've mentioned before, murder rates go up in the summer. This is because heat can make people behave more aggressively. Additionally, across the globe, violent crime tends to be positively correlated with how close a country is to the equator. Research has found that while most people are law-abiding and would never murder someone or commit a violent crime, however, a small percentage of people, about 5 to 6%, account for half or more of all crimes, including violent crimes. So when confronted with the same situation, people differ in their tendencies to behave aggressively. Certain personality traits can combine to create a proneness to aggression. People with high levels of negative emotions like irritability and mistrust, impulsivity, and a lack of closeness to others are especially prone to violence. One of the most replicated sex differences is that males are more aggressive than females. At least some of this difference may be due to the fact that when angered, men are more likely than women to want to enact revenge against people who have offended them. Age plays a role as well. The rates of crime, including violent crime, would drop by about 2/3 if all males between the ages of 12 and 38 were just placed in like a temporary hibernation. I didn't say that, the book said that. While the link between testosterone and aggression has been debated, the female spotted hyena may prove the rule. They have unusually high levels of testosterone and are more aggressive than their male counterparts. And that ties into the picture I have here. You may be thinking, but Miss Kilgore, why do you have a picture of a bull shark? Well, I will let you know. A little fun fact is of all animals in the animal kingdom, bull sharks have the highest level of testosterone, which is why they're considered one of the most aggressive breeds of shark. Back to the lecture. Social factors may play a role as well, at least in humans. Parents and teachers pay more attention to boys when they engage in aggression than to girls when they engage in dependent behaviors like clinginess. However, the male predominance for aggression applies mostly to direct aggression, like physical violence and bullying. Research has found that girls tend to be higher in relational aggression, which is a form of indirect aggression involving spreading rumors, gossiping, and using nonverbal put-downs for the purpose of social manipulation. This demonstrated that women are just as likely, if not more likely, than men to express anger in subtle ways. Men also exhibit more bullying than women, a finding that extends to the internet as well. Culture also shapes aggression, so physical aggression and violent crime are less prevalent among Asian individuals, such as Japanese and Chinese people, than Americans and Europeans. Once again, this boils down to collectivistic versus individualistic culture. Additionally, those in the southern U.S. are more likely to adhere to a code of honor, a social norm of defending one's reputation in the face of perceived insults. This may explain why levels of violence are higher in the South than other parts of the country, but this increased violence only arises in the cases of disputes, not robberies and the like. Alright, so a belief is a conclusion regarding factual evidence, whereas an attitude is a belief that includes an emotional component. So attitudes reflect how we feel about an issue or a person, which is why they're important to our social worlds. A common misconception is that attitudes are good predictors of behavior. For example, a lot of people believe that how we feel about a political candidate predicts if we'll vote for or against them, but it doesn't. This is why political polls are rarely foolproof. So, reviewing multiple studies, the average correlation between attitudes and behavior is about 0.38, which is moderate at best. Even though attitudes predict behavior better than chance, they're far from powerful predictors. This probably reflects the fact that our behaviors are the outcome of many factors, only one of which is our attitudes. Occasionally, our attitudes do predict behavior fairly well. Attitudes that are highly accessible, so they come to mind easily, tend to be strongly predictive of our behavior. Additionally, attitudes tend to predict behavior when they are firmly held and stable over time. Attitudes also predict behavior well for a group of people called low self-monitors. So self-monitoring is a personality trait that assesses the extent to which people's behavior reflects their true feelings and attitudes. Low self-monitors tend to be straight shooters, whereas high self-monitors tend to be social chameleons. Lastly, just because attitudes can predict behaviors doesn't mean they cause them. In fact, sometimes behaviors cause attitudes. So, where do attitudes originate from? So, our experiences shape our attitudes. The recognition heuristic makes us more likely to believe something we've heard multiple times. Like most heuristics, the recognition heuristic generally serves us well because things we hear many times from many different people are often true. Moreover, this heuristic can help us make snap judgments that are surprisingly accurate. However, when a story is persuasive or interesting, the recognition heuristic can get us into trouble, like with urban legends. It can lead us to fall for stories that are too good to be true or byproducts that seem familiar just because we've heard their names a lot. Good marketers will take advantage of this by using catchy jingles. Additionally, hearing one person express an opinion 10 times can lead us to conclude falsely that this view is as widely held as hearing 10 people express it only once. Our attitudes are also often associated with our personality traits in important ways. While we may persuade ourselves that our political attitudes derive completely from objective analyses of social issues, these attitudes are often affected by our personalities. So, some controversial research found that across many studies, conservatives tended to be more fearful, more sensitive to threat, and less tolerant of uncertainty than our liberals. These researchers and others have suggested that these personality traits are the psychological glue that binds conservatives' political attitudes toward the death penalty, abortion, gun control, school prayer, national defense, and a host of seemingly unrelated issues. Conservatives even tend to have larger amygdalas than do liberals. One important note I want to make is these differences don't mean that conservatives have psychological deficits or so don't take that from this. Like I said, those studies were controversial. Our personalities even relate and maybe influence our attitudes toward religion. The specific religion we adopt is largely a function of our religious exposure while growing up and is mostly independent of our personality. However, our religiosity, depth of religious convictions, is linked to personality traits. In most cultures, individuals with high levels of conscientiousness and agreeableness are especially likely to become deeply religious as adults. So, many of us are surprised to learn that our attitudes on many topics change over the years. We tend to perceive ourselves as more consistent over time in our attitudes than we really are, possibly because we don't like to think of ourselves as weak-willed flip-floppers. One note I do want to emphasize here is that it's okay to change your attitude as part of personal growth. Acquiring new information and shifting your attitude accordingly is how you're supposed to process new information, not disregard it completely because it didn't fit your narrative. Anyone that thinks your attitude is flip-flopping is wrong, and I will not be told otherwise. So one of the influences here is cognitive dissonance theory. So Festinger defined cognitive dissonance as the unpleasant experience of tension resulting from two conflicting thoughts or beliefs. Because we dislike this state of tension, we're motivated to reduce or eliminate it. Going back to one of my ridiculous and honestly one of my favorite examples I've given you guys to demonstrate this. So are hot dogs, tacos, or sandwiches? For the sake of this example, let's say that someone believes hot dogs are both simultaneously tacos and sandwiches. If you hold an attitude or belief, like hot dog is a sandwich, that is inconsistent with another attitude or belief, hot dog is a taco, we can reduce the anxiety resulting from this inconsistency in three major ways. So we change our belief that a hot dog is a sandwich, change our belief that a hot dog is a taco, or introduce a new cognition like hot dogs are Crunchwrap Supremes. So Festinger and Carl Smith conducted the first study of cognitive dissonance in the late 50s. Since their study, hundreds of other experiments have yielded results consistent with cognitive dissonance theory. Alternatives to cognitive dissonance theory are as follows. So some scholars believe that it's not dissonance itself that's responsible for shifting our attitudes, but rather threats to our self-concept. From this perspective, only certain conflicts between attitudes produce cognitive dissonance, namely, those that challenge our views of who we are. There are at least two other explanations for cognitive dissonance effects. The first is self-perception theory, which is a belief that we acquire our attitudes by observing our behaviors. The second is impression management theory, which believes that we don't really change our attitudes, but report that we have, so that our behaviors appear consistent with our attitudes. As is often the case in psychology, there may be some truth to each explanation. Some participants exhibit attitude change because of cognitive dissonance, others because of self-perception, and others because of impression management. Whether we realize it or not, we encounter attempts at persuasion every day. If you're like the average college freshman, you've already watched 360,000 commercials. And that number doesn't even count the number of advertisements you see virtually across the internet. What's more, each time you walk into a store or supermarket, you see hundreds of products that marketers have crafted to make you more likely to purchase them. According to dual process models of persuasion, there are two alternative pathways to persuading others. One, the central route, leads us to evaluate the merits of persuasive arguments carefully and thoughtfully. In many respects, the central route operates through the analytical mode of thinking. When using this route, we focus on the information content of arguments. We're especially likely to take this route when we're motivated and able to evaluate information carefully, like when deciding which college to attend or buying a car. The attitudes we acquire via this route tend to be strongly held and relatively enduring. The other, the peripheral route, leads us to respond to persuasive arguments on the basis of snap judgments. This route operates largely through the intuitive model of thinking. With the peripheral route, we focus on the surface aspects of arguments. We're especially likely to take this route when we're not motivated to weigh information carefully and don't have the ability to do so, like when we're distracted. Although attitudes we acquire through this route tend to be weak and relatively unstable, they can affect our short-term choices in powerful ways. The danger of persuasive messages through the peripheral route is that we can easily be fooled by superficial factors, like how physically attractive, famous, or likable the communicator is, or how many times we've heard the message. Psychologists have identified a host of effective techniques for persuading others. Many of these methods operate by means of the peripheral persuasion route, largely appealing to our intuition and bypassing our scientific thinking capabilities. Successful salespeople have used these techniques for decades. As someone who had a brief stint in sales, I'm going to weigh in a little bit on some of them. So the first technique is the foot in the door technique. So following on cognitive dissonance, this suggests that we start with a small request before making a bigger one. For example, if we ask someone to volunteer, we ask them for 1 hour before asking them for 5 hours a week. Because of cognitive dissonance, they will feel the need to justify volunteering the 1 hour by telling themselves they enjoyed it, so they'll be more likely to volunteer for 5 hours. In car sales, this can be seen with the salesperson wants you to take a test drive before asking if you want to buy the car. When I did sales, once we had someone agreeing to buy one product, we would ask if they were interested in getting the bundle instead. When I sold back massagers, we would ask customers if they would like to try one, then once they'd heard our sales pitch, ask if they wanted to purchase one. The next is the door in the face technique. This is the opposite of the foot in the door technique. With this technique, you ask for a large request before a small one. This is commonly seen in business negotiations. If any of you have ever watched the show Shark Tank, this can be seen a lot. So people will come in asking for a fair amount of money, knowing they probably won't get that much. So when the sharks, aka the investors, make them a smaller offer, they take it because they probably knew they weren't going to get the big offer they initially asked for. One reason this may work is because it makes the person being asked feel guilty for denying the small request. However, if the initial offer seems insincere or unreasonable, which has happened multiple times on Shark Tank, beautiful to watch, this approach can backfire. Third is the lowball technique. This is when the seller of a product starts by quoting a low sales price and then mentions all of the add-on costs once the customer has agreed to purchase the product. This is commonly referred to as the bait and switch. You bait the customers with a low price and then switch the price to higher because of all of the add-on cost. By the time the deal is done, the customer may end up almost spending double the amount of the original offer. And the fourth is the but you're free technique. One easy but powerful means of getting people to agree to requests is by giving them the sense that they're free to choose whether to perform the act or not. So research suggests that this doubles the odds of compliance to a request, probably because people given a free choice can convince themselves that they made the choice on their own and weren't pressured by the person making the request. This is also why most people, or this is probably why most people hate pushy salespeople. If you emphasize that it's their decision, they're more likely to buy the product as opposed to if you're beating them over the head with it. When I did sales, if a customer told us twice that no, they weren't going to buy it, then we had to let them go and just not badger them. If they were unsure, we would let them sit on the massage chairs for as long as they'd like until they came to a decision. Research demonstrates that we're more likely to swallow a persuasive message if famous or attractive people deliver it. This is why companies routinely ask celebrities to endorse their products. Fortunately, you can protect yourself against this by learning how to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate authorities. We're also more likely to believe messages when the source possesses high credibility, such as assumed expertise. This is probably why Netflix asked Neil deGrasse Tyson to do the reboot of Cosmos. Yes, it was a reboot. The original was done by Carl Sagan. He was presenting information most people have no idea about, so they needed someone they knew was an expert to help break it down for them and add a layer of legitimacy to the information. This is also probably why medication commercials feature doctors in white lab coats, and why so many commercials have like 4 out of 5 doctors recommend. One thing I do want to add here is Neil is a legitimate authority, whereas the actors in white lab coats are not. If it's an actual doctor in a white lab coat, then it's probably legitimate, but a lot of the time those people are actors. Messages are also especially persuasive if the messenger seems similar to us. For example, one study found that if students believed they had the same birthday as Rasputin, they would think more positively about him than if they didn't. Yeah, we're talking about pseudoscience again. So many proponents of pseudoscience use persuasion techniques to get people to buy their products. The appeal of these tactics almost surely helps to explain why so many intelligent people fall prey to pseudoscientific claims. The best way to resist these tactics is to learn to recognize them. Pratkanis identified a variety of persuasion techniques to watch for when evaluating unsubstantiated claims. We should bear in mind that people can use these tactics to persuade us of a variety of claims of both the pseudoscientific and everyday variety. So first, we have the creation of a phantom goal. This is done to capitalize on the desire to accomplish unrealistic objectives. So one example is master the complete works of Shakespeare while you're sleeping. And the reason this is an issue is extreme claims are usually impossible to achieve. Next, we have the vivid testimonials, which we've touched on a little bit before. And this is where you learn about someone else's personal experience. Sandra was depressed, but now she's not because of this. Or she was severely, extremely depressed, but now she's not because of this medicine. And the problem here is a single person's perspective is virtually worthless as scientific evidence, but can be extremely persuasive. Next is manufacturing source credibility. So we're more likely to believe sources that we judge to be trustworthy or legitimate. For example, Dr. John from Princeton endorses this thing. The problem here is advertisers may present the source in a deceptive fashion by twisting or distorting facts. Next, we have the scarcity tactic. Something that's rare must be especially valuable. So call before midnight to secure yours. They sell out fast. Scarcity may be false or a result of low production because of low anticipated demand. And this is why diamonds are so expensive. The diamond corporations force scarcity so they can hike that price right on up. Next, we have the consensus heuristic. So if most people believe that something works, it has to work. So thousands of psychologists use the Rorschach ink blot test, so it must work. The problem here is common knowledge, as we've learned this semester, is often wrong. Next, we have the natural commonplace, and this is a widely held belief that things that are natural are good. This all-natural product is so good for you, it's so much better than conventional medicine. Natural doesn't inherently mean healthy. Some natural remedies are good, like lavender and honey can help a sore throat. There's a natural antagonist for poison ivy, so if you use that, it helps the swelling, the itching, the rash, all of that stuff. There are some natural remedies that are good, but just because something's natural does not make it healthy. Always, always, always double check this stuff, because anthrax, ricin, and arsenic are all 100% natural. That doesn't make them safe for human consumption. And lastly, we have the goddess within commonplace. So a widely held belief that we all possess a hidden mystical side that traditional Western science neglects or denies. The CSP program helps increase your natural abilities, yada yada. And the issue here is carefully controlled tests fail to support supernatural ability or potential. Remember, metaphysical claims are outside the realm of science and typically indicate pseudoscience. So as we can see, several of these tactics make use of heuristics. But heuristics are commonly misleading, or occasionally misleading. Many of these also take the peripheral route to persuasion, rendering us less likely to evaluate claims scientifically. As we've seen here, a lot of intelligent and educated people hold false beliefs. For example, 29% of Americans believe vaccines contribute to autism spectrum disorder, despite the lack of compelling scientific evidence for this claim. Moreover, we live in a world in which it's increasingly difficult to distinguish fake from real news on the internet and social media. Thankfully, social media platforms have started to take steps to reduce the amount of and the spread of misinformation, but it's not foolproof, it's not 100%. We might assume that merely debunking a falsehood over and over again would be sufficient to reduce misinformation, but this approach is usually ineffective. In fact, debunking a myth multiple times can occasionally backfire, leading people to become more likely to believe it. That's probably because the myth sounds familiar, and as we've learned, that can make it seem correct. We also need to be especially careful when challenging assertions that threaten people's deeply held beliefs, because doing so can create cognitive dissonance, leading them to reinforce these beliefs. And I think this might be part of why some things happen the way they did in the past 4 years, but that is purely just my theory. Research shows that to convince someone that their beliefs are false, one should ideally provide listeners with an alternative explanation for these beliefs. Additionally, when dispelling false beliefs, it can be important to emphasize truths at least as much as myths, so that truths begin to sound familiar as well. Alright, so prejudice is the drawing of negative conclusions about a person, group of people, or situation prior to evaluating the evidence. Prejudice is usually the result of ignorance. Ignorance is just not knowing something. If people don't know something, this can lead to misunderstanding, and that can lead to prejudice, which can then lead to discrimination. Did my best to illustrate it in this little cycle here. This is why I highly encourage everyone to learn as much as you can about groups that you are not a part of from someone that is a part of that group. If you want to learn about indigenous peoples, there are plenty of books written by indigenous people. Same can be said about Black people, Latinx and Hispanic people, Asian people, members of the LGBTQ community, Jewish people, Muslim people. The list goes on. If you don't push yourself to learn about these groups from members of that group, there's not a high likelihood that you will learn about them in an accurate manner. You may be exposed to some ideas, but if it's not from a member of that community, there is a chance that it will not be an accurate representation. So, a stereotype is a belief about the characteristics of members of a group that is applied generally to most members of said group. The book says these can be positive or negative, but there are no positive stereotypes. All stereotypes are damaging in some way to members of that group. Stereotypes typically stem from adaptive psychological processes. In this regard, they're like other schemas, that they help us streamline information processing. As a consequence, a certain amount of stereotyping of others is probably inevitable. To some degree, stereotypes can reflect a core truth, like most people stereotype men to be more aggressive than women. At the same time, we need to keep a close eye on our stereotypes, as they can be the seeds from which prejudice grows. They can mislead us when we use them to paint people with too broad of a brush, as when we assume that all members of a group share a given negative characteristics. They can also mislead us when we cling too rigidly to them and are unwilling to modify them in the light of disconfirming evidence. In these cases, stereotypes can fuel confirmation bias about people that are different from us. This is why educating yourself about other groups is important. The more you can expose yourself to disconfirming evidence and listen to and learn from it, the less likely you are to engage in stereotypes or spread them to others. Stereotypes can also influence our split-second interpretations of ambiguous stimuli. In some cases, they can be accurate, in others, they can be disastrously wrong. For example, some of the cases of this going wrong are the shootings of unarmed people of color by the police. One study done by Carell and Associates found that participants were more likely to shoot unarmed black people in a lab setting, not actually shoot them. Otherwise, that would have been on the list of unethical stuff we covered, than unarmed white people. Another example is the instances of Karens calling the police on people of color who are simply engaging in everyday activities like a cookout at a public park. Y'all remember this lady? The internet named her Cookout Karen because she did exactly that. Some stereotypes are massive overgeneralizations. These stereotypes reflect the presence of illusory correlation because they indicate the erroneous perception of a largely or entirely false association between the minority group and a given characteristic. Stereotypes can also result in what Pettigrew called ultimate attribution error, which is the assumption that behaviors among individual members of a group are due to their internal dispositions. When we commit this error, we also tend to attribute any positive behaviors of disliked groups to luck or to rare exceptions. Like the fundamental attribution error, the ultimate attribution error leads us to underestimate the impact of situational influences on people's behavior. For example, when examining crime, people tend to forget that proximity and poverty play large roles in how many crimes are committed by members of certain demographic groups. Once we've acquired stereotypes, they come to use quickly and naturally. Research suggests that overcoming stereotypes takes mental work. The difference between prejudiced and non-prejudiced people isn't that the former hold stereotypes of minority group and the latter don't, because both hold stereotypes. Instead, it's that prejudiced people don't try hard to resist their stereotypes, but non-prejudiced people do. Some researchers have argued that a broad tendency toward prejudice is deeply rooted in the human species. From the standpoint of natural selection, organisms benefit from forging close alliances with insiders and from mistrusting outsiders. This is part of a broader evolutionary principle called adaptive conservatism, which creates a predisposition toward distrusting anything or anyone unfamiliar or different. Members of one race tend to show large skin-conducting responses to fear-inducing stimuli that have been paired repeatedly with faces of a different race. We quite easily and perhaps quite naturally associate scary things with people from other races. I have issues with that. I don't have time to get into it unless you guys want like a 3-hour-long lecture. But still, notice the emphasis of tendency. If there's an evolutionary predisposition toward fearing or mistrusting outsiders, that doesn't mean it's inevitable. Two major biases are associated with our tendency to forge alliances with people similar to us. The first is in-group bias. This is the tendency to favor individuals inside our group relative to members outside of our group. This bias appears to emerge in children as early as preschool. This may be reinforced by our tendency to turn off our compassion toward outside group members. One study found that the medial prefrontal cortex, which tends to become more active when we feel empathy towards others, shows more activity when people think about those in their in-group and less active when people thought about members of an outgroup. The second bias is outgroup bias, which is the tendency to view all individuals outside of our group as highly similar. Outgroup homogeneity makes it easy for us to dismiss members of other groups in one fell swoop because we can simply tell ourselves they all share at least one undesirable trait, which is just simply not true. Additionally, people are especially likely to view outgroups as homogeneous when they're critical of the in-group or don't share the in-group's views, possibly because that way they can perceive the negative feedback as coming from one blob of people rather than from many independent people. There's one research team, Tajfel and Turner, who studied in-group and out-group dynamics for years. It's one of my favorite parts of psychology to study. It's super interesting. They used what's called the minimal group paradigm, in which they would sort people into groups based on the most arbitrary things, and still in-group and out-group bias happened. I'm going to upload one of the papers they did. Highly encourage everyone to read. It won't be on the test, but it's just phenomenal. Like, love it. They found that in-group and out-group biases can form from something as insignificant as the color of a pen participants were assigned to write with. Like, the blue pen people hated the black pen people, and the black pen people hated the blue pen people. Like, something that insignificant still led to in-group and out-group bias. Their findings were actually part of the backbone for my master's thesis. Their research was the foundation of all sorts of group identity research, from how group identities form to ethnic identity development and beyond. Highly recommend their research if you're interested in research on prejudice and group dynamics. Like, it's phenomenal, super well done. It blew my mind the first time I read it. Like, just amazing. As I mentioned earlier, prejudice can turn into discrimination, which it's often confused with. Discrimination is the act of behaving negatively toward members of outgroups. Prejudice is the negative opinion or belief about members of specific groups. And discrimination is acting on those beliefs. So discrimination has significant real-world consequences. For example, women and people of color are represented far less than white men. One example is how Marvel and DC made so many superhero movies, but only one had a black lead that was a protagonist. One. Another example is how we have had 45 presidents and only one was black, and never a woman. However, we do finally have the first woman vice president, the first black vice president, and the first Southeast Asian president, or vice president, not president, I'm sorry. But yeah. A third example is how for decades most dolls were white, i.e. Barbie and Ken. On top of this, discrimination can affect individuals in the professional realm as well. For example, some people may not get a job that they're more than qualified for simply because they have an ethnic-sounding name. Just because their name's not John or Steve could negatively impact the likelihood of them getting that job. Discrimination can be subtle, but powerful. A great example of subtle discrimination is through microaggressions, which I'm really surprised the book didn't discuss. That feels like a major omission on their part, but whatever. So a microaggression is a term used for brief or commonplace daily, verbal or behavioral, like, I can't even pronounce this word, indigenities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards stigmatized or culturally marginalized groups. One example is, "You're so pretty for a," insert minority group here, "girl." Or, "You talk white," when someone is speaking, or when a person of color is speaking very eloquently and very articulated. Another common one is, "You don't look," insert minority group here. Even though these are subtle and unfortunately common, they are still discriminatory and have negative impacts on those they are said to and about. So, of course, talking about prejudice and discrimination, gotta talk about my Lady Jane here, Dr. Jane Elliott. Or, I don't know if she's a doctor. Jane Elliott demonstrated that prejudice and discrimination are learned. by having those with brown eyes discriminate against those with blue eyes. She did this with children to show them how easily prejudice and discrimination are learned. Now, I don't have time to go into all the specifics, but I am providing a link here to an Oprah episode in which they replicated this with Oprah's studio audience. It's phenomenal. Highly recommend everyone watch. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, dig into her research some more. Like, it was groundbreaking for its time. Like, she started this in the 60s. As with a lot of psychological phenomenon, the roots of prejudice are complex and multifaceted. However, psychologists have honed in on several crucial factors that may contribute. First is the scapegoat hypothesis. This is the claim that prejudice arises from a need to blame other groups for our misfortunes. For example, many Europeans and Americans blame immigrants for their own unemployment and job loss. Next is the just world hypothesis. This is the claim that our attributions and behaviors are shaped by a deep-seated assumption that the world is fair and all things happen for a reason. Ironically, this can foster prejudice because it can lead us to blame groups that are already in a one-down position, including women discriminated against by men, people of color discriminated against by white people, members of the LGBTQ+ community discriminated against by straight people, and the list goes on. Under this, you often see people blaming the victim for the discrimination they experience. And third is conformity. Some prejudiced attitudes and behaviors probably stem from conformity to social norms. Such conformity may stem from a need for social approval. We've all met someone that's done this. At least I have. That was like most of my high school, but whatever. It's outside the realm of this class. Moving on. So, while most surveys demonstrate that interracial prejudice has declined in the U.S., critics of this belief that racial prejudice, especially from white people, has gone underground, meaning that it has become more subtle. At least that was the case when the book was written. Anyways, one approach to studying subtle prejudice is to measure implicit prejudice. Implicit prejudice is the unfounded negative belief of which we're unaware, and explicit prejudice is the unfounded negative belief of which we are aware. Increasingly, psychologists have tried to capture implicit prejudice in the laboratory. One implicit technique that's received substantial attention over the past decade or so is the implicit association test, also known as the IAT. Researchers might ask a participant to press a key on the keyboard with their left hand if they see a picture of a black person or a positive word like joy, and press a key with their right hand if they see a white person or a negative word like sad. After a few trials of this, they'll swap the pairings, meaning that they will pair black people and negative feelings on the left hand, and white people with positive words on the right hand. Many studies demonstrate most white participants respond more quickly to these pairings in which black people are paired with negative words. This is believed to indicate that white people have an implicit association of black people with negative words. Researchers have expanded the implicit association test to other forms of subtle prejudice, including racism, sexism, homophobia, religious discrimination, and ageism. If you'd like to take the test, I have a link for it right here on the slides. It does have its drawbacks, though, like low correlations with questionnaires of prejudice, but that could be attributed to the social desirability bias. People don't want to report that they're prejudiced because they don't want to be viewed negatively. Another one is that some positive findings linking it to real-world racism may stem from only a handful of participants with extreme scores. Remember the bit about outliers, how they can shift the data, make it more warped and more distorted than it actually is. And that's the rationale behind that. And some believe that as a result, it may not measure implicit prejudice for the substantial majority of people. And lastly is combating prejudice. So, a really famous study was the Robbers Cave study. I found a little video about it. One of the means of reducing prejudice is to encourage people to work together toward a higher purpose By doing so, they can believe they're no longer members of separate groups, but part of a larger and more inclusive group, which would kind of help eliminate some of that outgroup bias. Another approach is jigsaw classrooms. So Aronson incorporated the findings of Robbers Cave into his work on jigsaw classrooms, which is an educational approach designed to minimize prejudice by requiring all children to make independent contributions to a shared project. This and the Robbers Cave study underscore a lesson confirmed by many other social psychology studies. Increased contact with those outside of your demographic is often not sufficient to reduce prejudice. While it is necessary, it is not sufficient. You really, really need to work on educating yourself, familiarizing yourself with those groups, combating your own prejudices, and just recognizing that different people have different life experiences and different worldviews, and learning from the experiences and worldviews of people that are part of a demographic that you are not.